Hi, I'm Brian Lutz, and this is Chris Jones, my partner in crime. We are going to talk about the Journal of Science Communication. I have a handout that we have passed out to those who are physically in the audience with us, and hopefully I'll be able to splice that into the videos so that our folks out there in TV land can see it. But to talk about this very briefly, there were three things about science communication and the way that they present themselves that we found most interesting. They seem to be very concerned with the theory and practice divide, and that's specifically between the sciences, but also between the sciences and the public. They are also very concerned with communication and the general public, and whether or not the general public can understand or perceive what it is that is going on within different scientific communities. They also are very keen on this idea of having a public awareness around contemporary public debate and civic discourse. So they touch on a number of issues from healthcare policy, education reform, international development, environmental risk. Also interesting about this is that our own Iowa State's Eric Abbott, who's a professor and director of graduate education at the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, sits on the editorial board for it. For our presentation, we're going to focus on just one article each that we felt really kind of captured the heart of what the journal is really after. And our approach was kind of topical as opposed to doing it by segments in time. So we just chose the things that were most interested in us and our particular niches in the field. With that, I turn it over to Chris.
Sure, and I should mention we do have a group member who isn't here, Snezhana, and she was interested in exploring articles that dealt with a lot of visual communication, so unfortunately you won't hear her talk about that tonight, but perhaps she'll put together a video later on to talk about that. I was particularly interested in medicine and the rhetoric of medicine, and so I sought out that in this particular journal and was actually really happy with some of the results that I got. And so the article I'm going to talk about is by Donnell, and it's titled Representation and Negotiation of Complementary and Alternative Medicine, a Citation Context Analysis. And I thought that was really interesting that that's the methodology is strictly rhetorical analysis of citations and how citations are used in scientific journals, specifically looking to explore how the citations of clinical alternative medicine trials are articulated to create boundaries between alternative medicine and biological medicine or biomedicine. So the author spends a lot of time critiquing the placement and the tone of these citations, which I found incredibly fascinating. And author focuses on three what would be considered alternative sort of medicine, and osteopathy, acupuncture, and yoga. So these are sort of the three. There are certainly others that could be talked about as well. And so the author explores how these are talked about in other scientific articles that are published, and how they're citing this, and what that means in the creation of boundaries. And so that was very rhetorical, and what is medicine attempting to accomplish by setting up those boundaries and creating these sort of, whether you think they're artificial or not, these boundaries that set things apart like that.
Awesome.
On to you.
So my niche is, I do many things, but rhetoric of advocacy is a big passion of mine. So I'm very interested in sort of how social movements build themselves within the United States and how they communicate their purposes. So I was sort of going at different journals that may speak to that in some way, and one that I found was Robin Jensen's Using Science to Argue for Sexual Education in U.S. Public Schools. For Jensen, her problem was that advocates for comprehensive sex education were having trouble swaying the public towards their point of view because their methods seemed to be focused on what science has to say about sex education and sort of what the research results were. And she says that that's a problem because when it came to the opposition seemed to have a more moral argument about whether or not sex education should be taught in public schools. So Jensen, through a hermeneutical study of newspapers, conference transcripts, and other public documents, analyzed this rhetorical event where Dr. Ella Flagg Young was able to successfully advocate for a sex education program for the Chicago school. And this was during 1913. She went through all of these materials and argued that the reason that Young was so successful is that she took the opposition of the time, which also posed this very moral argument, and she co-opted it into her own argument by saying that issues of sex education are an issue of public health and also individual health. So she was able to successfully advocate her position by doing so, and Jensen concludes her article by saying that contemporary advocates for a more comprehensive sex education should follow Young's example and actually link the science of today to the moral concerns of today. What I thought was especially interesting about Jensen's article, two things. One was her attention to context and kairos. So she identifies that Young was working in this progressive era, which is defined as this time when there was a well-known infatuation with modernity, science, and expert, and when there was this contentious, value-laden appeals to authority that we also can now see in the present day. So she's saying that the time is sort of ripe for having a similar strategy. What I also thought was interesting is that we should see two names here in which we find very familiar. Alan Gross, The Rhetoric of Science, and from Stephen Talman's The Uses of Argument. And she assumes that communication scholars agree that the dichotomy between morality and science is in many ways artificial. And she asserts that the field of rhetoric of science has repeatedly shown that science is not value neutral, and that it actually is very value laden, and we just need to identify what those values are. So we're going to conclude by just talking about two major takeaways that we feel those in our field should really understand about science and communication, especially if we're dealing with this question of incommensurability.
Sure, yeah. So the first one is that there's a line drawn, and perhaps we haven't figured out exactly where it's at, but between science communication and the rhetoric of science, and where is it out? And Greg has often mentioned that at conferences, communication studies people also often don't identify themselves as rhetors, even though they might be doing the work of rhetoric. And that was a lot of what was going on in this journal, in fact, is that they were often doing the work of rhetoric, but tiptoeing around the lingo that some of us might use. So they weren't actually using terms like rhetoric or using some of the prominent figures that we tend to cite, but they were doing the work of rhetoric. So it's that rhetoric by any other name type of mentality is what was going on there.
And to build off that, if we were to put a tentative definition on the kind of rhetoric that's being done, it seems to be in line with the more classical ideals that authors view their role as bridging scientific knowledge with the knowledge and literacy of the general public. There isn't an assumption, however, as we kind of see in the classics often, that the general public is necessarily ignorant to science. It seems to be that the incommensurability is where the public needs to be swayed by a demonstration of what science means for them. And this isn't true in every case of every article that we found, but that seemed to be a fairly common thread with what we found. So hopefully everyone will find that helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.